I'd like to welcome you to this meeting and talk just a couple minutes about some background about why we're all here together through a unlikely confluence of events. Boulder County, the City of Boulder, and CU all recognized the need to update our transportation master plans at about the same time. I should mention also that the City of Louisville is also updating their master plan, and the City of Longmont recently did last year. So a lot of recognition about the need to take another look at how we do mobility in this part of the world, in this part of the region. Tonight we really have two parts to this event. One is the open house, which you've started looking at the various boards, talking to the staff at the various boards and asking questions and hopefully providing input. On your chair you also have some note cards and pens, and at the end of this panel we'll be opening up the panel for questions, so if you have questions we'd love to collect them from the cards and use those to keep the conversation going. After the panel, then we'll again have open house opportunities for you to look at the boards and ask questions and make comments. It's really important that we work together, and this provided a great opportunity for us to talk to you all at one time about what's happening in transportation and between the City of Boulder, CU, and the county. Because speaking from the county's perspective, what happens in Boulder doesn't stay in Boulder. We are all interrelated, and it becomes increasingly apparent through time that our universe of mobility universe is expanding drastically. So we have to work together. We have to work with our partners throughout the county, and increasingly we have to work with our partners outside the county. And for those regional movements, that regional mobility, we have to work with our partners, CDOT and RTD, who really manage much of the network that we have to work through. You know, some of the dynamics that have caused all of us to start looking at how we do business is clearly the cost of housing, the jobs housing balance, what's happening in the city in terms of housing costs, in terms of employment. More and more people are coming from further and further away to work in the city, whether it's the City of Boulder, certainly, and increasingly City of Longmont and our other communities. We're getting older. The percentage of people over 65 in the county is forecast to increase by 60% in the next 2 decades. That has huge implications for mobility. Right now, about 50,000 people commute into the City of Boulder every day from communities outside Boulder and from adjacent counties particularly. A growing proportion of the workers and students are commuting to Boulder County jobs or to CU from further away, from Weld County, from Larimer County, Broomfield and Adams County, where housing is more affordable. Indeed, right now, over 30% of the people who come in on the diagonal each morning, their trips start in Larimer and Weld County. We need to figure out how we can work collaboratively with Weld and Larimer County communities, which are not in our usual organizational structure. We've always been focused on Denver, working with our Denver partners and counties. We need to work constructively with new people and new institutions. To underscore the need, by 2040, the Denver Regional Council of Governments forecasts the number of people commuting in and out of Boulder County communities will increase by over 60%, with a large growth coming from Weld and Larimer counties, who are not part of RTD, so RTD can't currently serve them. And so we need to find, again, ways of serving our commuters and citizens with new institutional structures. Weld County, currently about 69,000 people a day commute in and out of, trips a day commute in and out of Weld County to Boulder County communities. Dr. Cog is forecasting that will increase to 140,000 trips per day in and out of Boulder County to Weld County. So I just wanted to take a sec to lay out some of the issues and concerns of why we need to talk and work together. We're facing transportation funding challenges on every level, whether it's local, county, regional, or state. That's a challenge as we move forward, is how do we decide how to pay for what we want as citizens. So this is a panel, how we can move forward together through regional collaboration to address some of the big issues facing our communities while keeping our communities the special place it is. My special fear as transportation director for Boulder County is that we not screw it up. What makes this place special is not the roads, it's everything around the roads. And so we need to figure out how to move people through the county in a way that keeps it a very special place. We need to increase commuters, the increase in commuters from further away, the affordability of living in Boulder County, much less traveling through Boulder County as people move further away for affordability. Sustainability, how do we do this in an environmentally responsible, constructive way? How we deal with the funding shortfalls, and how we work with our partners are those huge challenges we're facing. So that's my background sermon. I'm going to turn the microphone over to Will Tour now, who will moderate the panel and doesn't need much of an introduction. He's been around for a long time, messing around in sustainability, energy, figuring out how we can move people back and forth in a responsible way. Whether he's former mayor of Boulder, former county commissioner, former boss who hired me, and now the director of the state energy office. So thanks for coming out tonight. Let us know what you think. Tell us when we're on track and tell us when we're missing the boat. And we can move there together in a more constructive, hopefully successful way than if we each do it alone. So thanks for coming. Fill out your cards and let us know what you think. So Will.
Thanks, George. And I have to say, it's great to be back home in Boulder before it's dark for once. So, yeah, great to be able to be here tonight. And I thought I would just take a minute. So I'm director of the energy office. We're here at a conversation on transportation. But this really fits, I think, with the direction that the Polis administration is taking. I think Governor Polis is really looking at problems as being integrated issues that need to be addressed across the typical silos of government. So the world that I work in that's largely focused on energy and climate change, well, transportation nationwide is the largest single source of greenhouse gas emissions. In Colorado, it's number 2 to electricity generation. But as our electricity generation gets cleaner and cleaner, transportation will become the largest single source. So as I think about what do we do to try to meet the kind of ambitious energy and climate goals that Governor Polis has set, we can't get there without working on transportation. And that means working on how do we have a system that functions for people, that allows many people to travel without having to drive in single occupant vehicles for every trip. And it means how do we move towards more efficient and electrified vehicles. And so thinking about things in an integrated way, I think is going to be a hallmark of the approach at the state level, and I know is very much a hallmark of the approach here locally. So with that, I'm going to do quick introductions going down the table. So first, my new best friend, Shoshana Liu. Shoshana is the executive director of the Colorado Department of Transportation, came here from Rhode Island, where she was chief operating officer of the Rhode Island DOT. And before that was at the U.S. DOT and a number of positions within the Obama administration. Suzanne Jones, I don't think needs any introduction here. Mayor of Boulder, great all-around person. Very tired this week. I think she has had many meetings going very late into the night. David Kong, Vice Chancellor for Infrastructure and Sustainability at CU Boulder, and a former naval officer who served as Director of Project Management at the White House Military Office. Another person who probably doesn't need a lot of introduction, Elise Jones, Boulder County Commissioner, Great job. Lynn Geisinger, our newly elected RTD board member, sitting next to our former RTD board member, John Terre, director of the Chamber of Commerce, and as I first knew him, former policy advisor for the city of Boulder. So please welcome our great set of panelists. So to start, let's just go around the group and take a couple minutes each to express what are the key transportation challenges that you see and that you're trying to address. Shoshana?
Sure. Thank you, Will. And I will say from my perspective, one of the very best things about my new role in Colorado is that I am not the only person with an endless energy to talk about the mechanics of clean cars. I think to Will's point, thinking about transportation in the context we're in has to be a conversation about sort of how all of the factors, including our behavioral choices and the kind of sustainability of the technology itself, come together in a more kind of environmentally friendly pattern for the way that we approach transportation. And that is very central to the Polis administration's view of the mission of CDOT and to the way that we are approaching the project planning and development process within our department. One of the things that I wanted to kind of take a moment to talk about today, as much as a sort of plea for public participation as anything, is to sort of preview a process that we are going to be going through over the next weeks and months at CDOT, where we will be reopening the planning process, the sort of process by which we identify the projects that are priorities across the state of Colorado, with a sort of view towards integrated priorities for what our transportation does. We sometimes have a tendency to sort of start with a big dollar figure, we need this many billions and trillions of dollars of transportation, and not to sort of start with the basic questions: where do we need to go? How do we need to go there? What is the way to do it in a sort of sustainable manner that will protect the places where we live? So the kind of process that we will be undertaking at CDOT is one where we will start with a kind of presentation of those challenges and really engage in a public discourse around kind of the things that we are trying to do with our transportation. Access to jobs, healthcare, education, beautiful places to recreate, and kind of ways to get there kind of conveniently, equitably, and sustainably. And sort of starting from that, then talking to folks about where that leads us in terms of the projects that are priorities, to sort of move safely across our system to all of the places where we need to go. So to sort of start that process off, we will be reinitiating the kind of formal CDOT planning process, the tip and the stip for those who are kind of familiar with the acronyms, but deliberately in a way where we don't talk about it in terms of the acronyms, but rather in terms of the kind of goals across the board in terms of how we do planning. So, I wanted to kind of take a moment to talk about that here because it strikes me, hearing about the good work that all of you have been doing already, that it kind of integrates nicely into this dialogue that we are going to be initiating very soon, and it's very central to how we are going to be going about establishing priorities in a multimodal way. And I will end on noting that one of the kind of important points of this process is that it is going to be a sort of modally agnostic conversation. Not the way where sometimes the highway plan is siloed from the transit plan, which is siloed from the freight plan. It is going to be a conversation about needs across the board and kind of taking an intentionally multimodal and in some ways a technologically agnostic view of how we get to the solutions that best serve people's needs in solving the challenges that we talk about.
Hello. Thanks, Will. Thank you all for coming here. I am always reminded how wonderful it is to live in Boulder and have so many people that care about what I think are really key issues. I also want to say how fabulous it is to have a new administration and to have these really smart, progressive big thinkers in office serving us. So how about a round of applause for Will and Shoshana? I don't know, it gives me a lot of hope for the future about what we can accomplish in the next, let's say 8 years. Just give us 8 years. So in terms of the city of Boulder, we talked about a few things that are challenges. One of them is climate, right? I think emissions in Boulder are 20% of our emissions comes from transportation, not quite as much. It's not number one as it is nationally, but it's an important piece of us solving the climate problem. And we know how important that is. We talked a lot about, or we just mentioned that our affordability issue is regional, and housing and transportation are linked. So how we solve transportation is part of the way we're going to solve housing, and it's going to be solved regionally. And I'm heartened by all the work we're doing, both in the county and with municipalities along the US 36 corridors, and regionalism is the way of the future. I also think that increasingly, and this shows up in our transportation master plan focus areas, but trying to figure out how to be walkable, bikeable, more livable communities in the face of increasing population and increasing traffic is a key focus area. And getting to Vision Zero is very, very important. And we're a very walkable and bikeable community, but we've kind of stalled out. And so what do we do next to make people feel more comfortable doing that? And how do we guarantee they'll be safe if they do? So that's a big focus area. So in our transportation master plan that we're updating, that we've just engaged all of you on, and we hope that you'll continue throughout this year with us on that, there's going to be 5 focus areas. One is complete streets, which is how do we provide all these choices, transportation choices, in a way that works with land use and makes it easier to do the more environmental thing, I'll put it that way, in terms of walking, biking, transit. Another is the regional travel that we're going to be talking about a lot more, I think, right? And addressing transportation demand management. And then how are we going to fund this stuff? We have some real funding challenges, as you know, both at the state level, the regional level, and then here locally, in order to just keep up with maintenance, let alone providing more options. And then finally, the sustainability component. And there's a lot of really exciting things to talk about in terms of electrification. How do we harness the new technology around autonomous vehicles to make them serve our purposes in terms of being electrified, shared, and freeing up more real estate that we don't have to use to park cars. So anyhow, those are some of our challenges, and there's a lot of opportunities. And I'll end it there because I assume you're going to ask us some really engaging questions about all of that.
So I'd like to start off by saying, the university has been here for almost 150 years, and we are very fortunate to be in a community where what I see is a lot of alignment, a lot of cooperation in trying to solve a lot of problems that we all care about. And I know many of these folks personally, and it's really great to be here talking today. As you can imagine, the university's primary focus is on 2 things. Number one, educating the future generation, right? Making sure that we create informed citizens and leaders of the future who can really, really contribute to society. The second thing that we do is discover and do research to solve really wicked problems. Transportation is one of them. Climate is another. Energy, sustainability, these are all things that we work hard every day to solve on the university. In order to do that, there's a lot of things that need to be built. Buildings, labs, and how do we connect all those? And here today we're going to talk about transportation and what are some of the challenges. For us, we need to be able to effectively move people within the campus, but more importantly, Will touched on it. We do have some affordability issues on housing. We have a lot of commuters that come in. How do we effectively move our students, our faculty, and our staff here in a sustainable manner? So those are things that we really, really deeply care about. Also, affordability is a big issue. How do we affordably do that, efficiently do that, and sustainably do that? These are challenges that are not only present for the university, but it's also present for the community. And I know the state is here to help try to solve those issues. And the comment I made to Will was, I'm so glad. When are we going to start getting things done? Let's work together. And I think we all have the intent of just that, right? And that's why we're here. It's not by accident that we're all working on the same hard problems. I think we recognize that these are issues that need to be resolved, and we're actually making concerted efforts, not just sitting on a panel, but meaningful dialogue to actually try to move these conversations forward. So I'm really looking forward to continuing that with the city and all the folks that are here right now.
Great. Good evening, everyone. And I, too, want to thank you all for being here. And it's great to have 2
wonderful members of the new cabinet with us in Boulder County. I wanted to point out that my two fellow county commissioners, Deb Gardner and Matt Jones, are in the audience. Wave to the people. Boulder County is in the house. So you've already heard a number of the challenges, and I don't want to be too redundant, but I do, if you're ticking off the list, transportation funding has got to be at the top. Proposition 110, unfortunately, failed at the November ballot. Had it passed, we would have had over $700 million worth of projects coming to our corridor to help us do things like bus rapid transit. We voted for it, but the rest of the state largely didn't. We're also about $37 million short in our 5-year capital improvement plan just for, sort of basic maintenance of our roadways. So we do need to collectively think about how we're going to fund transportation and mobility in a way that's sustainable, because right now, none of us, I think, have enough funds for that, neither the state, the city, or the county, or the university. And nowhere is that funding shortfall more acute than with transit. And RTD is a great partner, sitting here next to my good buddy Lynn Geisinger, RTD director, but it's a very challenged relationship. We are one of the few corridors that hasn't seen the full benefit of the fast tracks that we voted for in 2004, and people are a little bummed out about that, right? We're not going to see Northwest Rail till 2040, right? So, and RTD's financial challenges are also leading to cuts in local bus service, bus service here. And so we need to figure out how we can not only bolster the lines we do have with you, but how do we infuse our transit system with new resources so we can really deliver on the multimodal needs that our community needs. We've already touched on affordability. I want to echo what the good mayor said about, we know we have affordable housing crisis, but it's an affordable living crisis. We have to include transportation in that equation. We need to make transportation more accessible and more affordable, because it's all connected in how we solve how people can afford to live in our community. We need to make transportation and housing affordable both. We talked about emissions. Obviously, climate change is an existential crisis that we are facing, and we have felt it very acutely here in Boulder County. We have to deal with that. The other piece of the emission equations is ozone. Vehicle emissions is one of the top two, along with oil and gas, that are leading our non-attainment with the Clean Air Act on ozone, and it has real public health costs in terms of asthmatic kids and elders with respiratory problems, and drives a pretty big healthcare cost. So we need to not only electrify to deal with climate change, we also need to do that to clean up other air pollutants as well. I would say from a county standpoint, I also would want to raise the issue of transportation in our mountain communities. It's a little easier down here, but our mountain communities have unique challenges to try to provide them with transportation choices. It's costly, it's tough weather, it's tough topography, and we have to think through that as well. And then last but not least, safety. I think we know that really acutely. We've been having pedestrian and bike fatality and accidents far beyond what are acceptable, and we need to make our transportation corridors safe for everyone. So I'll stop there and turn it over to Lynn.
Thank you. I'm Lynn Geisinger. I've been on the RTD board for all of 9.5 weeks now, so I'm feeling pretty expert. Yeah. And in the interest, I knew that we'd all be thinking of a lot of the same overall topics, so I'm trying to limit my responses on a lot of things to RTD and let you know what's happening there. As I was getting ready to talk about the challenges, I saw a really nice blog that Audrey DeBarris from Commuting Solutions wrote today, celebrating transit. So I'm going to take just a minute to talk about the good things that have been happening, and then we'll talk about some of the challenges. One of them that you'll hear more about, I'm sure, as we go along is just the great work on US 36 and the Flatiron Flyer. Flatiron Flyer immediately, once it went into effect, showed a 29% increase in ridership, 8.5% increase between 2017 and 2018. It's a very successful managed lane and BRT project. They RTD is working on a number of innovative pilots. They're one of the first places in the country to get the transit added to the Uber and Lyft apps. So if you go to, and it's not everywhere, they're rolling it, Uber and Lyft are rolling it out for certain areas, but you can go to the Uber and Lyft app and see what the transit option is and what that costs and how long it takes, which we're hoping can be a really nice addition. Launched one of the first autonomous vehicle pilots. It's a shuttle that runs around an area at 61st and Pena down near DIA. The AB Skyride is one that I'm sure many of you as transportation people have enjoyed taking to the airport. Saves lots of money. RTD is 2,400 square miles, 300,000 boardings per day, over 100 million boardings per year. It's a big project. All of that said, there are a lot of challenges. One of the first questions I ever get asked is, when are we going to get our rail? And I often answer that it will certainly be at least late May. But, there is some progress. They're talking, I thought that the other director that covers part of Boulder County was here, but I'm not seeing her, Judy Lubau. Is she here? Anyway, she may come in a few minutes. There's effort underway to work on a peak period rail, which would be 3 trains in the morning from Longmont down through Boulder and Louisville, all the area, to downtown Denver, and 3 trains in the afternoon coming back. There is some movement going on there. The Mayors and Commissioners Coalition has written a letter urging that to move forward. The governor has expressed interest in helping get involved. A lot of it is trying to get Burlington Northern to give a price, and Burlington Northern, I am not at all going to paint as the bad guy, because I don't think they are. They worked very hard to give us a price for the overall rail a number of years ago, and they took a lot of heat when people didn't like the price. And now RTD doesn't have the money to move forward, but Burlington Northern has gotten in touch with RTD and said, we'd like to come show you a new hybrid rail car that we have. So we know that there is some continuing interest. Eco passes, neighborhood eco passes, student passes, those are all very high on my agenda and protecting, and we were able to protect them. We were also, RTD, the board last year passed a low-income pass, which we may talk a little more about later, and expanded the youth pass. RTD has big funding issues. There was a lot of trouble in the 2007-2008 recession with the sales tax and just the rising costs and things like that. But the board is about to consider a resolution to really try to push the effort to finish fast tracks. Service concerns, I share Elise's concerns that the city and county are doing some great work to expand service, and I hope that we will see increasing collaboration and cooperation. One of the big problems for RTD in that sense is that RTD and transit agencies all over the country are having a hard time hiring drivers, operators. We're down by a number of operators, mostly on the bus side. So those are some of the challenges. First and final mile is always a challenge, getting people from a fixed route bus to their homes, and we'll talk about some more of those later.
Well, as the final panelist to speak on this, I'm going to say that I am just depressed by the conversation thus far. So I'm just going to say something positive. The first thing is that just as the business representative at the table, I get to say some unique pointed things on behalf of a specific interest. But the first thing that I want to say is that it's unique that we are working in a community that has such great collaboration. David mentioned it. I mean, these are friends, these are colleagues, and folks who I trust to work through the solutions that are going to both represent business interests and the residents of our community. So that is something that I know will carry us forward to address the challenges that we confront. But what are the specific challenges that are of highest interest to business folks that I work with? And first and foremost is that challenge of the 60,000 in commuters, or whatever that number is precisely on a daily basis into Boulder. I often think, gee, you know, when I'm driving to Denver at 7:30 in the morning and I see the traffic backed up to Broomfield coming into Boulder, I think there's no way in hell I would take a job in Boulder and have to deal with that. So number one concern for businesses is the challenge that the commute faces, or that the commute poses for recruiting the workforce that we need to fill the jobs that we have in our community. It's absolutely a critical issue for us. When we can't house everybody here, we know they have to get into in and out of Boulder on a daily basis. We need to make that commute more convenient. The second thing is that it's not just workers that are coming in and out of our community. It's goods, it's products, it's the things that fuel the businesses, literally the fuel that fuels the businesses. And that when that gets caught up in the congestion that is associated with the traffic in and out of Boulder that needs to go on the roadway system, that is a major barrier to business activity, slows down businesses, and can create real pressing issues for businesses that depend on in-time production activity. So we need to be attentive to not just the commuters, but the goods and services, or goods and products that come in and out of our community. And then finally, there's always going to be, and when we're thinking about the investments and the needs that we have to address our transportation challenges, there's always a cost associated with that. And too often, I think that business interests feel that there's a perspective that, boy, the problem is created by the workers that come into our community. I think that's the wrong attitude. That's an attitude that we need to correct. Folks who come into work in our community are bringing value. They're working in the businesses that keep our economy strong and sustainable. So we need to think, when we're talking about costs, that it's not just that they should bear the cost, that businesses should bear the cost, or that the employees should bear the cost, but there should be a shared expense for both recognizing the benefits and the impacts of having a strong economy that draws a larger workforce into our community. So those are the challenges that I see. My last comment is, I don't know how many people know what today is. This is the first day of March Madness, okay? So I'm looking around this room and I'm thinking, transportation madness in Boulder, that's what draws people out. So I applaud everybody for being here.
Thanks, John. So I'm going to ask a number of questions. We'll take about the next half hour for some questions that I'll ask, and then we'll turn it over to questions from everybody out here. So remember to write your questions down on those note cards, and we'll pass them up in a bit. So lots of folks talked about the challenges involved with 60,000 people a day commuting into town. And so a number of questions related to that. And I would say, as I ask these questions, not everybody needs to answer every question. If somebody else has already answered, feel free to pass on, because there will be plenty of questions. So kind of one of the sort of interesting aspects is that the city of Boulder in some ways is unique for the region. It's relatively dense compared to many of the communities further to the east, where many folks are commuting in from. And it's probably better served by transit, a little more walkable and bikeable. You've got a lot of folks coming from places that don't necessarily have sort of great infrastructure for getting around any way other than driving. Given that, how can we provide sort of sustainable transportation for folks commuting into Boulder in a way that works for them, given the very different nature of sort of where they're starting and where they're ending? Who wants to jump in on that one?
I'll get it started. Because we all could have additions to this, but I do want to point out that this is important. I just want to point out, because it's one of the things that we hear a lot is, the traffic is terrible in Boulder, which of course is all relative. But it is interesting that per our traffic counts, most of the traffic increase over the last few decades is all from external traffic coming in. the in-community trips have stayed the same. So since 1994, the vehicle counts exiting and entering the city have increased by 35%. So that's sort of the congestion that people are feeling and talking about. It's this external, the commuting traffic, which again isn't bad. It just needs to be better managed. So I guess the vision for that a lot of us work together on is to try to replicate the US 36 model of managed lanes, bus rapid transit, BRT, or close as we get to it, and the regional bikeway, and to do that along all the major corridors entering Boulder. And so the next big priority is to do that along Highway 119 to Longmont. And we are busy raising money for that. We just went to DC, the US 36 Mayors and Commissioners Coalition, to lobby the feds to give us money, and we're working with RTD and CDOT on that. And then the next corridor in priority is State Highway 7, which, as you know, goes to Lafayette and then on all the way to Brighton and I-25, and to figure out how to get that model of bus rapid transit and managed lanes and a bikeway on that corridor as well. Those are multi-year, multi-decade sometimes projects, but that's part of the vision in addition to addressing eco-passes. But I'll let some other folks jump in here, but that's part of the solution that we're all working towards.
So I would just jump onto that. I would say two things. It's about transportation choice, and that's why the US 36 model is great. You know, HOV carpools, you can pay a toll, you can ride the bus rapid transit, you can ride a bike. And we need to give choices to people so that however they show up into our county, they can have different choices. The other thing is regional cooperation, and that's why it's so great to have Director Liu here, is we need sort of partners to innovate with to figure out this challenge. We can't just deal with transportation in the city of Boulder or in Boulder County because that traffic is crossing multi-jurisdictional lines. So we need to think regionally. And I think one of the roles that we play here is forcing our partners out there, the other cities in the counties in the metro area, to think about multimodal transportation. I sit at the Denver Regional Council of Governments at meetings at least twice a month where we have conversations about, is multimodal, you know, a four-letter word, or, you know, is it something everybody can really embrace? Because there's parts of the region that really aren't sure about, you know, whether or not, you know, buses are evil conspiracies. And we really need to help them along, educate them, and make sure any of the funding pots that come through either, you know, ballot initiatives from the state legislature, federal funds through CDOT, that they're multimodal so that we have a chance to help those communities think multimodally as well.
If I can add to that, you know, the point that you raise about the traffic coming from commuter traffic in and out, and sort of the way that parlays into a need for regional thinking about the issue. I think that plays out in a couple of ways. You know, one, in terms of having sort of a truly regional plan that helps people to sort of see the ripple effects of having more choice and having more efficient choice, you know, in sort of key corridors, right? You know, sort of intuitively, we know that if, you know, through a variety of choices, you can reduce traffic on, say, I-25, it has kind of beneficial impacts for everything that could be a diversion route. But, you know, we have a tendency to sometimes think about these things in silos and not kind of tell a clear story about how the way that the system works in part impacts sort of the neighboring areas. You know, I think the other aspect where that comes into play is in the way that we talk about modal choice, and, you know, not letting it be treated like a four-letter word to talk multimodal. You know, I think there is a element of just behavior change that needs to happen in order to expand the use of public transit in places where it has not been the norm in the past. And, you know, I think some of that is just sort of an educational issue. And, you know, because we're afraid of it being a four-letter word, I think we sometimes shy away from just talking to people about how options can play into different parts of their lives in different ways. But, you know, if you build it, they will come is not necessarily true in terms of sort of imposing more options in places that haven't historically had them. You know, I'm coming most recently from the Northeast, where, you know, the Rhode Island where I was living did not, you know, have a great variety of public transit options, and when they were sort of layered in, they didn't always work. And it wasn't necessarily because people didn't believe in it. It was in some ways because their lives were not built around it, and kind of getting people to sort of even just have the factual information to arrange their day differently and understand the benefit of having your commute time to catch up on work instead of being stuck behind the wheel is not what a lot of people are used to. And if we shy away from talking about what the realities of sort of behavior change, I think it's hard to kind of make it effective.
And then I'm just going to, I'm sorry, David, you want to go? Oh, I'll go. So I'm going to get just real practical, targeted micro, and say that the word convenience has got to be a factor. We have actually pretty good, strong regional connections. But what I often say is that it shouldn't take 20 minutes to get from Longmont to the bus station at 30th Street, and then 50 minutes to a half hour to get to 55th Street. I mean, those kinds of connections need to be much more convenient for our workforce. That would drive them, I think, to think of transit as a much preferable option. Second, to achieve that first and final mile connection, I think we need to be flexible. And what do I mean by that? I think we need to be throwing lots of creative solutions at the problem. Everything from using the ride-hailing services and the new technologies that are available, but down to the scooters. I know that we confronted that as an option for our community. People are afraid that they might litter the sidewalks or something like that. Let's give it a ride. Let's give people a chance to experiment with that. It may be that is the solution for folks rather than having to wait for a connector bus that then they're uncertain about the timing on. So convenience and flexibility to me are absolutely critical.
And I don't think it's just one solution and then another solution. They all kind of overlap together, right? So, the ideal situation would be, let's not get into our, single occupancy vehicle and drive, right? So that's something that we can address probably with housing, and we're doing that as a campus with our housing master plan. What's the right mix of faculty, staff, and student housing so people don't have to drive? It also creates community and resilience for the campus as well. The convenience factor, I lived in DC for 6 years. I took public transit the whole time. And why did I do it? Because it was affordable, right? Because there was a subsidy. I got $250 when I first moved there, and then I got $120 a month after that. But it was affordable. But then, to John's point, it was convenient because it was easier and faster to take the bus or the train than to drive. Right? And then there's no parking, and so it has to be convenient. So when we talk about the HOV lane, it also has to be with an express bus, and it also has to be, really more than one person, going in the vehicle with the traffic backed up 20 miles. But we gotta provide options for people that are affordable and convenient. There's some other ideas that we can also work with our neighbors, right? So we did a survey, and not everybody wants to live in Boulder, right? They sometimes want to live someplace else. And so we have to recognize that, right? So if we have concentrations of folks that live in other parts, of the county, for instance, how can we work with those cities to create maybe park and rides and, express buses and things like that? We can't afford to do that as a campus, but maybe as a community, as RTD, as the county, as the city. That's something that maybe if we work together, pool our resources, that we can do that. One of the other real great innovations in the DC area were what's called slug lines. So you stand in a corner somewhere in DC or in Virginia, and you know that somebody will come pick you up, and you don't talk to them. There's these rules, and I hadn't heard about anyone getting hurt by taking slug lines, but you get in the car, which allows them to get into an HOV lane. You don't talk. They know where you're supposed to get dropped off because you're standing in the corner that says you're going to get dropped off at the Pentagon or at the White House or at the Navy Yard, wherever. And I think the WASI app is trying to do some of that, but that's a huge opportunity. But then that's not going to work unless an HOV lane is available, right? And actually people are bought into that. And then on the affordability issue, I think public transit has to be a critical component of this in order for this to be successful. And we are very concerned about the College Pass program and the Ecos Pass program, and we really want to work with RTD and the community to make sure that those programs continue to be successful and viable. But there's a lot of things that we have to work on together.
Well, we don't have as cool a name as Slugline, but recently Dr. Cog and RTD and Commuting Solutions has launched the casual carpool on Highway 36, where you can line up a carpool with someone you don't know in order to get into the HOV lane. And so we're looking forward to seeing how that works. I have been very impressed. We talk about the areas around here. I think going back to DC and in the state as well, one of the things that I've been hearing a lot, I think that we hear a lot, is the importance of this Northwest Corridor and the 36 mayors and commissioners all working together, coming in and speaking with one voice, because there's lots of people looking for that money everywhere, and to be able to come in and say, we're working for the region. And I'll just say that I'm also excited about the planning process that you're starting in CDOT, because the example of that I think George was talking about at Highway 119, where 30% of the traffic coming down Highway 119 starts in Weld and Larimer counties. That's outside the RTD district, and there's some good things happening there with Flex and Mustang. But I think bringing us all together to start looking at the different regional issues is an important step.
So I want to do a bit of a follow-up to David's comments. So you talked about the university looking at the housing plan as part of the way that you're addressing transportation. So how important is it for housing to be part of our planning process on transportation? And if we want to address regional transportation issues, what should we be doing around housing in our communities?
I think it's extremely critical, and John touched on it. We have a lot of issues recruiting students, especially graduate students, and faculty and staff, because once they figure out how expensive it is to live here, they go, I can't afford to come to school there, right? And so we're missing out on an opportunity to really engage with maybe the brightest minds in the world because it's unaffordable. And so that's a driver for why we're looking at housing. But back to the transportation issue, if they can't get here, it's a problem, right? And so we want to make sure that they can get here, and there's multiple solutions to getting that, and I talked about some of that stuff, but it's all kind of a holistic view that we have. So we have our campus master plan update that's due in 2021. And we have multiple efforts right now so that we actually create a usable and relevant master plan for the campus. So we're concurrently with the transportation master plan. We have a housing master plan. We're also doing a visioning to look at what is the future of higher education and what does that mean for the campus. We're also doing an energy master plan so that we can think about how do we integrate renewables, how do we create resilience for the campus. And when we do that, it's not just for the campus, right? Because we are part of the community. And so a resilient campus and a sustainable campus means a resilient and sustainable community. So these are all things that are happening right now because we can't do just one thing in a vacuum. They all are parts of a bigger puzzle, and that's kind of how we're approaching it.
Thanks. Shoshana?
It's a great question, and I think the short answer is that they're inseparable. Like one of the, I have the pro and the con of being new to Colorado, and one of the things that is good about that is that you can, at times sort of see the patterns in real time and, kind of have a moment of shock at how fast things are changing. Now, about 2 weeks after I got here, I was driving north on 25 towards Larimer County, and, the folks I was driving with sort of pointed out where all of the new developments were happening. And, I kind of did a double take, and I said, what do the people who live here now think of that? And, we kind of went back, we did sort of a heat map of where the population growth is expected. And, particularly for someone who hasn't been as familiar with it before, the sort of expected growth in the Front Range is shocking. I mean, shocking in a good way, but also presenting, a kind of imminent challenge of how we deal with population growth, the development that kind of attracts it and responds to it, and the pressures that it puts on the transportation system that we all use. You kind of do the back envelope, in your mind, and if you take every new housing unit that's being developed and multiply it by 2 cars and put them on the road, it takes the congestion that we see now and brings it to an order of magnitude that we will never be able to build our way out of. And it kind of forces you to think about the question of, what levers do we have to kind of bring those conversations about how development is happening, where it's happening, and how the people who are kind of going into it, whether it's to live or to work, get around in ways that will, keep the place we live, the place we want to live in, and sort of keep it functional in a way that can continue to move people and goods. I think about the kind of the decisions that we have to make at CDOT, as we deal with places where development is happening. And, you can kind of see the questions that emerge, when there are new units developed in places that will sort of inevitably place more cars on one of our roads. It kind of creates questions about the conversations you have to have about, how you take the pressure off the system and sort of manage it. It's a hard conversation to have because it implicates, a whole number of issues about land use, and there's sort of no one jurisdiction that has the authorities to kind of tackle this alone. But I think if we don't sort of have a serious conversation about, where we're putting people and when and how we get them where they need to go, you end up with a kind of level of congestion that is not what anybody wants in terms of their day-to-day life.
Yeah, and I'll say that this is risking getting me up on my soapbox here, because for me, housing in our community is a social equity issue, it's an environmental issue, and it's a transportation and economic issue. So I'll focus on the transportation, but know that those are always in the back of my mind when I think of the Sierra Club saying, "Hey, listen, a policy that they promote." What am I losing my mic? I must have said something. As soon as I mentioned the Sierra Club, the chamber guy, that's a problem. The mic gets cut off. But what they're saying, listen, we need to, as a society, promote more dense infill development that allows for mixed use housing, commercial activities, because it's the environmentally right thing to do, and they primarily focus on the commuting patterns that facilitates. The more environmentally sensitive commuting patterns facilitates transit use, more walkable access to goods and services. So that's the general philosophy. But I remember, Will, when you were mayor and on the city council, going down to Dr. Cog in the early days of thinking about how to allocate statewide transportation money. And we thought about, why wouldn't we put a priority on funding for, in particular, transit investments that promoted for communities that were willing to put people in areas that would actually use the transit. That would be a criteria for measuring those kinds of investments. So I think, from a statewide perspective with the executive director here, that's something we need to be thinking about is that kind of promoting transit investments in communities that are facilitating higher density development. But clearly, there's no question, a city like Boulder, in my mind, needs to think about allowing for more housing, because not only is it an important thing for us to allow for more of our workforce to live and work here, and allows for a greater diversity of individuals to be in our community, but it also is allowing for folks not to have to commute back and forth to work every day.
As somebody who for the first time in my life has a commute that's longer than a Boulder Creek bike path, I can tell you, it's a wonderful job, but life is a lot better when you don't have a commute.
I'll just add quickly that we've got some recent studies about the transit-oriented development, just to back up sort of what John said, that 0.6% of the land area in Denver and Boulder MSAs is within a half-mile of an RTD station. And this area accounted for 24% of the multifamily housing and 32% of the office development between 2005 and 2018. So, there is, I think, the strong development focus where we have the transit available.
So Does anyone else want to speak to it?
Well, I'll just note, we like to argue about growth and development in Boulder. It's almost as good as March Madness in terms of sport. But I will note that we have a regional affordable housing strategy for Boulder County, which every municipality has signed on to, and it sets a 12% regional affordability goal. We're getting ready to revisit that here in the city of Boulder and up our goal to have permanently deed-restricted affordability of up to, I'm guessing we may land on 15% of the units in the city. So I know a lot of people don't think we're doing enough, but we're actually doing a lot. Could do more, but we are doing a lot. And one of the big issues is tying, I think, housing to transit. So whether it's at 30th and Pearl or Alpine and Balsam, you know, places that are on transit corridors where we're really trying to load up affordable housing. And we're looking at more accessory dwelling units and looking at big lot issues. So we're maybe not going as far as some people want, but we're going farther than others want and trying to really push the issue of permanently affordable housing. And it's a lot easier to do that along the transit corridors.
So I'm going to ask just two more questions and ask people to take just like a minute in your response, and then we'll move to audience questions. So money. A lot of folks have mentioned the fact that we don't have a whole lot of money for investing in our infrastructure. So, and Proposition 110 on the ballot last year would have raised taxes to invest in transportation. It failed by a fairly convincing margin. So what types of creative solutions are there out there to allow us to achieve the funding we need for transportation?
Well, I don't know if it's creative, but I think we collectively are sitting at every table, local, regional, state, looking at what's the best way to create transportation funding. Folks are trying to have a statewide conversation about what we can do. What's likely to happen at the state level is that there's a debrucing effort so that Tabor right now requires a refund of some of the taxes that are collected. What happens if we didn't actually give those back but invested them in transportation and also education? That is something that's likely to be on the ballot that you'll get to vote on, but that's one source of statewide funds that is being talked about. At the regional level, the Metro Mayor's Caucus and the Denver Regional Council of Governments are talking about whether or not there needs to be sort of a metro taxing district that generates revenues for metro area transportation. We're at the beginning of that conversation. People are weighing out whether or not that makes sense. Obviously, Boulder County's voters would be necessary because we believe in investing in public infrastructure. Our votes would be needed to carry the rest of the metro region. We have to think if that makes sense. And then locally, the Boulder County has a transportation sales tax, 0.1%, and it's going to need to be renewed in 2024. Should we increase that and work with our municipalities to figure out how to invest those transportation dollars? Those are all conversations that are being had, and I don't know that we've landed on any solutions, but the dialogue's in process and you should join in.
You know, one of the first conversations that I had with Will was, hey, Will, Volkswagen emissions scandal, $2 billion available. How do we tap into that? I mean, we had some real conversations about how do we put proposals together as a community so we can get that. I think being on the cutting edge, so there's grant monies available if you're on the cutting edge and the leading edge to try to demonstrate, say, electrification, vehicle-to-grid technologies, and then there's sharing of assets, right? So if everyone wants to electrify, but maybe the county has a bus facility, a transit facility, VIA has a transit center, maybe we can start sharing, you know, costs, right? So that we can share infrastructure. Maybe we build the charging stations, you buy the bus, and then I pay for the service. There are things that I think we can do that's not just what can I do, but more focused on what can we do. And then I'll just give one more example. We have a postdoc here who's been working with the city on grant proposals, and we just got the thumbs up for a National Science Foundation grant to look at mobility options for the disabled in the Boulder community. And so, I mean, that's a real opportunity to do some really good things. And I don't think we would have got that if the university and the city didn't work together to actually do that. So I think in April, we're going to have a transportation planner as well as our postdoc going to DC to talk to NSF about, all right, now we're ready to take the money. Please give us some.
And
Can I just add, what I think is likely to happen is that we're going to end up with layers. It's really too bad the statewide proposition didn't pass because it was the best chance to help the entire state, including the rural areas. But if that's not going to happen and we do something metro-wide, that could be interesting. But more locally, we're doing a transit service delivery study that looks at bus service in the city of Boulder. We're doing it with the county and CU, but because RTD keeps cutting service, and we run the hop, we pay for the hop, and VIA runs it, and we're having to buy up other of the bus routes, like the jump and the bound, but RTD keeps cutting the service just because they can't get the drivers either. So anyhow, we're looking at, we want to do more, not less, and we're kind of at cross purposes. So this study is looking at what are our options at the local level to layer up. So know that there's conversations happening at these different scales, and there's not going to be one answer. There'll probably be multiple answers as we look into the future.
So just real quick. I never want to cut off the executive director.
After you.
Oh man.
1 minute each.
I better say something of value. So I just want to second what the mayor said. I mean, we have to think of this as a layered system for funding solutions. We have RTD, we have state resources, but we now start to focus on the local, and we do know that our community supported the statewide tax. That tells us that there's a hunger for financing solutions. So then the question becomes, how do we best use that support and think of a taxing mechanism that, in my mind, is recognizes the shared benefit, so business and residents from investments in transportation, but also just want to suggest two things. One, sometimes I think we are, when you think about too hot, too cold, or just right, I think we kind of go with the just right, sort of in the middle, kind of a package of transportation investments. And I think that it's usually just a list of projects, and it doesn't have a theme to it. It's not something that I think the constituency can grab onto. So I think we should instead consider choices that are either small increments of investment. So, for example, take an initiative that goes after the diagonal highway. We're going to fix that transportation corridor, get it done, demonstrate success, and then move on to the next corridor and show the constituents that we can use their resources responsibly. That's one approach. The other that I think we also should consider as an option is the big vision approach. What is that funding amount, or what is that project that we really want to see done? Is it the train or my favorite, the gondola? Whatever it is, that is something that our constituents can see for themselves as wanting and willing to pay, yes, probably a significant more amount of money, but it really will be a monumental shift in improving our transportation system. So I'd say urge as we go forward and think about the next investment, maybe it's either micro or it is that big vision for the future.
That was actually a good segue to what I was going to say, which is that, I think we could go around and around and around on the different mechanisms to pay for infrastructure, and ultimately they are all some form of asking, people to invest. I think we need to flip the conversation to a degree to sort of stop talking quite as much about how we pay for it and talk a little bit more about what we're paying for. The analogy I've been using is that if you were trying to sell a house, you wouldn't lead by talking about the difference between an adjustable rate mortgage and a fixed rate mortgage. You would lead by sort of showing pictures that make people want to live there. And the same thing ought to apply with kind of building a vision for the future of how we get around. Let's start by painting a really compelling picture of what we're trying to do, and then ask people to pay for it once there's something very tangible to sort of hold on to and envision. And I think getting back to where I started with the sort of notion of going through the planning process with an eye towards the outcomes that we want, rather than sort of the pieces of road that we can repave or patch with potholes. I think it should be about what those outcomes that we want are, and then sort of, how do we get to them, both in terms of the sort of solutions and ultimately the way that we pay for the solutions.
Lynn?
And just quickly, I agree with all of those things, and I think New York City is a great example of what you're talking about, Shoshana, where they had to have a vision, and they found the money to make it a whole different sort of city. There are some interesting things. I just heard Phil Washington, who used to be here, now runs LA Metro, the transit for LA County. They're looking at a pilot, and they're picking out the area for congestion pricing. As he pointed out, he might need police protection to put that in place, but it's becoming part of the conversation. Vehicle miles traveled is becoming more and more of the conversation. It has privacy concerns, but if you have one of these, we already have privacy concerns, and I think people feel like it's worth looking at. And finally, I was shocked, but I've been hearing it again in the last few weeks that they're in D.C. they're talking about a gas tax that could be a 25 cents over 5 years. It's a big gas tax. It's not a great solution either because of the fact that with more fuel efficient cars and vehicles, and the fact that it's a regressive tax. But those are some of the things I'm hearing in addition to all of the local and regional and state layering ideas.
So I'm going to jump into audience questions now, and the first one will be a follow-up to that. So one of the first questions was, please comment on the benefits and challenges of implementing a congestion tax or vehicle miles traveled fee in Boulder and the state. Who wants to jump in on that one?
Well, I just threw out a couple, vehicle miles traveled. I think one of the biggest concerns is privacy, but, and I don't know all the intricacies of what it looks like, but I know that there's a lot of information being taken on what we're all doing right now. What was the congestion?
Yeah, a congestion pricing, congestion tax or congestion fee.
It's out of the box. It's different. The other thing Phil Washington said is that if they implemented it in LA County, they'd have enough money to buy everybody in LA County a bus pass. I'm not sure how valued that would be, but it's thinking out of the box.
Well, can I just say two things? One is the idea of getting in on the front end on autonomous vehicles and figuring out pricing related to that, as well as maybe the Uber Lyft situation, so that as we move towards maybe not owning cars, that we've already kind of built in the funding mechanisms that go along with those new types before there's a locked-in constituency figuring out how to set that up. I think that would be very wise. I also know that we also need to figure out maybe urban solutions that are different than rural solutions. Otherwise, we fight this this resentment that we are, in rural areas, when you drive, you have to drive farther. And so not unduly burdening folks that have less transportation choices with lower hanging fruit that we should be doing on the Front Range.
Shoshana?
And from a sort of purely logistical perspective, one of the reasons the gas tax has existed in its current state for so long is that it is easy to implement, and there's sort of very low transaction overhead to collect it. The system is set up to collect it kind of as the default option, and so anything that is not that is some deviation from the norm, which comes with sort of overhead in the obvious ways and in the non-obvious ways. The privacy concerns I think are real, but if I had to guess, I suspect they become lesser over time as really everybody has one of these, and the generation that learns how to drive never had a minute of their life when they weren't attached to one of these. The conceptions of what should be in the public and private space seem like they have a generational component to them. I think trying some of these places, these options in sort of discrete places may be, an interesting thing to look at. And, some of the things that we're doing already, whether it's with managed lanes or otherwise, actually are sort of a step in that direction. I mean, the kind of technology leap from, a managed lane to some form of congestion pricing is not all that Herculean. So, I think we are testing some things, and can kind of look at the discrete steps that we're taking and sort of see what we learn from them over the coming years. But sort of the reality is that the default option is the gas tax at the moment. So, anything that is not that, whether or not we should try it aside is kind of, battling the fact of inertia.
So another question that is related to funding. Got a question, can we repurpose some of our infrastructure for multimodal use? This would make projects much less expensive and encourage behavior change. For example, removing street parking to create bicycle or walk infrastructure, or using existing lanes for bus rapid transit instead of building new.
I love that question. And, I said we were doing a lot of things, a campus master plan, transportation master plan. And one of the kind of the guiding principles that we laid out to our transportation master plan consultant was, let's think about what the future could be and not be constrained by what is, right? So we need to aspire to do something, not live within what we already have and make that as efficient or effective as possible. So it's hard to grasp that sometimes, but who could have imagined, 10 years ago that on your app you could call a vehicle and within 5 minutes it'll come pick you up, right? And so there are things that are possible maybe 5 or 10 years from now that we can't even think about, but let's think about that and what could that potentially be. And when we build our infrastructure, let's make sure that we're thinking about the future as we do that. And parking is a really hard one, right? Because it has immediate negative impacts if you can't park your car and you have to drive. But if you think about it from the other side, it costs roughly $30,000 a parking spot if you build a parking garage. And so can that money be used for the university, for research, for hiring faculty, for providing scholarships, for reducing tuition? And then I'm sure similarly for the city or for other government agencies, could that money be used for more meaningful things, especially if the future may mean that we don't need to drive?
I would just add that that is the greatest promise of autonomous vehicles, is that we would be able to devote less asphalt to our real estate or did I say that right? Anyway, we'd have less asphalt and more real estate to do other things, and that could be increasing mobility, but it also could be other public amenities. And if we harness it right, we should have more infrastructure that we can use for better things than parking or general purpose lanes.
Yeah, I agree with all that's said. This just, of course, brings to mind a great debate that my good friend Sue Prant and I often have, as she doesn't even acknowledge that I'm talking. And it's the conversation about, how do you make a complete street and to integrate better bike lanes and better bike safety and HOV lanes, et cetera. And I tend to take the approach of not removing lanes, and because I just think it leads to the kind of antagonistic debate that we just doesn't progress us any further. It's sort of a repeat of the whole Folsom issue. Instead, I always take the sort of grow the pie higher philosophy. Let's try to figure out how can we create and find the space for better bike lanes, make those significant investments sometimes in a little bit of an expanded roadway so that we can accommodate both. But I certainly acknowledge what Elise and folks and David, much more esoteric than I ever am, that, listen, we are going to see changes in the technology over time, and we need to just be integrating as we're taught. This is about the transportation master plan for many years out. We need to be considering that the automobile, the personal automobile, is not going to be something that we're going to need to have parked right next to our place of work, maybe not even next to our house. And how do we prepare for that? We certainly aren't going to want to be investing in new parking garages. I don't even know if you could finance them today. So that's certainly got to be an element of our future transportation master plan thinking.
Shoshana?
And given the cost of building new infrastructure, I think we absolutely have to be looking always to sort of make the most efficient and best use of the sort of space that we have and the space that's built already. From the perspective where I sit, let's take an example that's not taking a lane away from one thing and giving it to another, but so in an area where the kind of left turn configuration is inefficient and is causing traffic, it costs a whole lot less to paint it over and restripe in a way that makes it more clear where people should turn than to go build another lane to adjust the turning. So, there are things that you can do to sort of the management of traffic patterns on existing infrastructure that make it possible to use the space differently. I think it's incumbent on us to do it where safety, is of concern. And, one of the things that we're looking at is that there's actually quite a number of things that we can do that are relatively low touch in terms of, new pavement that, can improve the safety of the system. But, in the same vein, looking at how different users interface in the same space, I think there are opportunities to do that better and to look to sort of lighter touch ways to reorient.
I'm going to throw in an editorial comment from my Boulder County friends from all the different institutions as you think about the TMP. And just following up on this question, I would look to some of the things that the city of Denver has been doing, which seem to be pretty successful. And while the Folsom bike experience, I think, has given us all a case of PTSD, and we don't want to go there, the experience in Denver has actually been, they've had multiple corridors where they actually have been able to repurpose space in ways that have been pretty successful. And they're now taking on repurposing space to bus rapid transit on Colfax, right in the core of Denver. So I would just encourage us to keep an open mind and think not only about the future, but what some of those opportunities might be, looking at what's successful just down the road. That sort of ties into, I think, another interesting question. What's keeping us from greater experimentation, just trying some stuff out and seeing what works? Sort of the idea of, instead of having to take years to plan things, could we try some things? If they work, grow them. If they don't work, stop doing them.
Yes. I think that it's long-range planning is a bit of a blessing and a curse, in that it sometimes can take longer to plan and execute something than the length of most people's imaginations for whether or not it was a good idea. I think particularly when we're thinking about trying to push people to think differently about ways that they could get around, being able to kind of test an idea quickly so people can have a real picture of what they might be looking at, has a great comparative advantage over, 10, 15-year studies where nobody knows where the money is going to come from, and, half the people may have moved on to another idea by the time it reaches execution. The world is moving faster than the typical transportation planning process.
I was just going to mention that for any of you that were at the Moving People Forward conference, right? That was a great conference, and the keynote speaker wrote a book about street fight, and it's Jeanette Sadikhan, who talked about doing that in New York City and changing the downtown Times Square into a people-focused place rather than an automobile-focused place. And her book is called Street Fight because, you have to experiment and have a thick skin and educate people that, hey, we're just going to try. We're going to fail sometimes, and but if it works, we're going to do it. And I think we should all read that book and sort of bolster ourselves to really be creative and innovative and be okay with knowing that it's not all going to work perfectly, and we get to play a little bit.
I have a story about experimentation. So last year during our Transportation Expo, we worked with the city to bring an autonomous shuttle, and it started hailing, and the shuttle would move. And so it's really interesting, but somebody has to figure this stuff out, right? We didn't buy the bus, but during the demonstration, it was evident that they had some issues. I think they stopped production on that. But these are real challenges, and I think there's opportunities, right? So we talk about the campus being a living sustainability lab where we should be able to test this stuff, where we should demonstrate it, and I think we should pursue opportunities, in partnership with our community to do that. Because I know we have faculty and we have students who would be very interested in doing research and data collection to make sure that maybe if it doesn't work here, we can figure out how to make it work here or somewhere else.
I'd just say absolutely. We need to be trying new things. Need to put things in the ground and get the momentum going. And see how they work. 5 years ago, who would have predicted that electric scooters would be such a huge hit? And in big cities all over the country, they're taking over for a lot of people.
Great.
Can I just say, as somebody that lived through the whole right-sizing thing, we cannot let that one incident, which did set us back, I will say, and there was some lessons to be learned, but it was also, I don't think, should not define us as a community and our approach to experimenting on traffic issues, transportation issues. So I think we need to take what we can from it and try some new stuff. But I do know it's been a few years. We can do it again, do it better. But we do need to kind of get back in the saddle because that was, Boulder needs to own innovation again.
Yeah. And, we sometimes forget how much of the stuff that exists regionally came about due to local innovation here. So there's a couple questions.
Wait, Will, can I just real quick? And so I wanted,
No, you can't.
as the person who brought up Folsom, I
You don't get the last word.
Exactly, darn it. No, because actually, I want to say I completely agree. I mean, we have to experiment, and we cannot let the Folsom situation. I mean, there was a lot of reasons why it ran into trouble, and define or limit us in future experimentation. But I think the lessons learned from it are critical. And to me, those are making sure that all the stakeholders are fully engaged. And yes, some of the stakeholders are not going to agree with you at the front end, acknowledge that. But then whenever you experiment, there are costs, and you have to be thinking about how do you compensate folks for those costs of the experiment in the front end so that they understand, hey, listen, we're taking a risk that may have a potential injury to you or a potential loss of business. Let us prepare you for it in some way that allows you to recover from that in a way that doesn't damage you for the long term. I think those are key considerations.
Yeah, no, great thoughts there. I was just going to remind us of the extent to which a bunch of things that we think of as being around forever actually started as Boulder innovations. So the whole EcoPass program and system-wide College Pass program, that started as this crazy experiment in downtown Boulder. And with the downtown Boulder Pass program back in like 1991 and the student bus pass program starting in 1992, they were considered kind of crazy ideas at the time, and they've turned into this enormous successful program that drives our transit system, creating the hops, the skip, the jump. At the time, we speculated, we were trying things we didn't know if they were going to work. Was it going to be the hop, the skip, and the flop? It's not the way it worked out. So take heart. Time for 2 more questions, and then we're going to go to the open house. The I will pass these on. The ones we don't get to, I'll pass down the line. And
We can have staff answer.
Maybe an online,
Yeah.
you could all answer, throw a little blog or something and answer all the questions or something. That would be really helpful for those of us who put questions in, they probably won't be
Yeah.
read. So it would be really nice to know that our questions were actually read and answered by you all.
We-
That's mine.
we'll quickly caucus and figure out what to do with the questions that we don't get to. Local representatives talked about integrating transportation with land use, especially housing. Is there anything the state can do to help with that effort? I think this question is for you.
Well, we've talked about it a little bit already, but I think the kind of providing more options that are realistic and efficient doesn't work unless we coordinate transportation and land use. I mean, they're too integrally related to be living in separate silos as they unfortunately sometimes are. I think it raises a lot of practical questions because the example of where I sit, I don't have the authorities to sort of implement the steps that you need to make some of the land use decisions. And it's an example of why we have to be tightly coordinated in the way where folks from really all levels of government are talking to each other about what the sort of vision, the goals, and the needs are. It kind of gets back to a theme that I think we've touched on broadly, which is that we have to have those conversations in an outcome-oriented way. But it has to get to a level of granularity where we then sort of talk about who's on first with respect to which decisions and how we kind of line them up in the ways that achieve the outcomes that we want.
I'm going to end with a question that I know is near and dear to the hearts of many people at this table. So somebody saying that they love the RTD system, but it's expensive. What are the barriers to expanding EcoPasses, and how can they be overcome so that we can have widespread EcoPasses throughout the system?
Sounds like one I should start with. I'm a huge fan of EcoPasses. It's one of the, one of my top priorities in running for the board. Last year they had I don't know, I think it was 20-month process, or 12-month process or something with the past program working group to come together, and two of the great things that came out of that working group and are just being implemented where they increased they expanded the youth pass for kids up through, I think it's free through age 5, and then it's 70% discount through age 19. And they finally put together a low-income pass, and it's 40% discount for anyone at or below 185% of the poverty level. A really crucial step, I think, in our equity efforts. But the EcoPasses, RTD's consultants in that process were clear that EcoPasses bring in revenue and ridership. They're great. If you look at those, the hop, the jump, all of the, not the hop, I'm not sure about that one, but the jump, the skip, all of the community, the CTN network here, the community transit network, those are the lowest subsidized and the highest ridership of most of the routes that RTD runs, and I'm convinced that that's EcoPasses. I'd love to see them expanded hugely. It all comes down to money, but we'll be working on it.
Well, I just wanted to hold up the example of Longmont and Nederland with regards to passes. In Longmont, the Boulder County and the city of Longmont worked to make the bus free, right? And you saw a huge increase in ridership, and largely from folks that were on the low income end of the spectrum. It was like 70%, less than 35,000 year in annual income, right? A key increase in ridership by making transit free. That would be the radical idea. We should just skip the passes, make it free. In Nederland, right? I would say the other experiment that Boulder County did was up with the town of Nederland, where we pioneered giving EcoPasses to everybody in town. It was so wildly successful that the town decided to have a local tax for everybody that lived in or around Nederland, so they all have an EcoPass, and they pay a modest amount. And then everybody can basically, it feels like you're riding the bus for free, because if you have an EcoPass in your pocket, you're 9 times more likely to take transit. So these are exactly the things that we need to be figuring out. And yes, you're right, it does come down to money and then some logistics with RTD.
I'll just add that there's 82,000 residents, students, and employees in Boulder that have access to EcoPass, and it makes a world of difference. That's one of the reasons why we have fuller buses here. We're driving the system. And one of the frustrations, as Lynn well knows, is we want to fill the buses, and it feels like RTD is not rewarded for full buses, and that's part of the problem. And aligning their business plan with increased ridership is, I think, one of those challenges that we need to get that aligned, because obviously it's a lot harder to give everybody in Boulder EcoPasses because we have such a much more complex network of buses as opposed to in Ned. There's one bus, so it's real easy to figure out. Yeah. So anyhow, but I do think that is a highly valued asset that the community wants. We've known that for years, and we got to get there. I'll just put it that way.
And I think there's a mix of responsibility too that should be discussed. So, as the mayor said, maybe it makes sense for the community to run its own community transit, if that makes sense. And maybe it's better for RTD to focus more on regional transit and how do we get from Denver to Boulder, and then so there's, I think, opportunities where we can help each other to make the service better.
Oh yeah, and businesses could actually help ensure their employees. I do think that this is where businesses could really help drive this as well.
100%. And I'll say a couple things. So first of all, I want to second what David said. I mean, I served on the RTD board gladly hand the baton to Lynn. It is rough service representing the Boulder area down in this regional body, trying to bring back resources from an organization that is strapped for cash. They're often maligned, but I know that they're not malicious. They are trying to make the best use of the dollars that they have available. That said, I do think that we know best what is the routing, the services that we need in our local community. And I think that if we worked with RTD to get them more focused on the regional service and allowed then any extra resources from RTD to flow to us to control, to drive our own local service planning, including the provision of passes or free service. To me, that's a direction that would be good, not just for Boulder, but I think for the entire RTD region. But I do agree that businesses have a role in supporting and driving this the expansion of the pass. The ones that get it, it becomes an addictive benefit for their employees. So one of our goals at the Boulder Chamber is to make sure that we're continually proselytizing for them to make that investment in the EcoPass. That's one way to incrementally increase, but probably ultimately a community-wide solution is the best approach.
Thanks. I wanted to note two more elected officials in the audience. Earlier we recognized Elisa's two companion county commissioners, but State Representative Jonathan Singer and Longmont City Council member Joan Peck. Thank you for coming. I don't think I missed it. Did I miss any others? I don't think so. So thank you so much to our panelists. What a thoughtful and interesting conversation as we address really difficult issues. With that, we're going to go to the open house now. There are multiple staff of the different agencies in the back by all the boards there, so stick around and talk to folks, and I imagine some of our panelists will be able to stick around for a few minutes also.